We've stopped several times and done takeaways, and so I've heard from several of you, but there are at least 3 people I have not yet heard from. So I want to hear, and yes, I know who you are. I want to hear something that you learned about Common Core, or an insight that you had. I want to hear something that you learned about instruction, something you learned about assessment, something in that area, but I want to hear from 3 people from whom I have not yet heard.
Are you going to point them out?
Not right. I would like them to volunteer. So at least 3 people have not spoken. I want to hear from 3 people who have not yet shared a thought about Common Core, a thought about instruction, a thought about students, anything from this morning.
Teach language in mathematics.
Teach language in mathematics. Is that what you're saying? Is math a language?
Yes.
Yes. Universal language.
Universal. Wow, she loves math. You love math. It is a universal language. Math is absolutely a language. You are teaching, when you teach math, you are teaching the language of math. Absolutely. 2 more.
You were telling me.
First one, I think how the math practices for Common Core are basically the same as what they were in the 97 standards. Just now we're teaching.
Yes. Had anyone heard that before? Had anyone heard before that the 97 standards and the Common Core standards are essentially the same? There are some nods.
Only because I've done it before.
Because you've done it before. Mm-hmm.
The teaching, what happened was that all of a sudden we all had to be on the same page at the same time as the administrator to walk in and we were all doing the same. I'm like, what?
It was the instruction. It was the instruction, and again, we started teaching to the test, and we started all of these different things. And I will tell you that they made the past 12-ish years, have made us incredibly passive. So that a lot of us want to be handed something. A lot of us want the Common Core textbook handed to us so that we can just follow, because that's what we've been doing. And so it's a little bit unsettling to think that we can't just do that. That doesn't make the change that needs to be made. We can take all of these Common Core lessons. I'm doing this. Some of them are, some of them aren't. We can take all of these lessons from all of these sources as long as we understand the instructional shift. And as long as we understand how and why and all of that, then absolutely don't create something from scratch if it's already there, but make sure that you're looking at it with a critical eye and that you understand the why behind all of the steps that they have embedded. The math lesson that we did earlier, that is posted on your website. And it has a script, do this, do this, do this. But you'll understand the why behind all of it because we talked about it as we went through. So make sure that you don't follow a script without knowing why you're doing each step and what the student burden is in each of those. Student burden, yes. One more. Yes.
You said something about word problems being actually making the kids think it's not given to them. And this past year, that's one thing I tried to implement is giving them problems that sometimes had unnecessary information, sometimes didn't, because a lot of times they just want to take the numbers and anyone know adds up and divide it by instead of thinking about what the numbers mean.
If there are 3 numbers in the problem, then I'm going to use 3 numbers somewhere. Dan Meyer illustrated that beautifully for me when I saw him. But exactly, we're very rarely in the textbook or on the worksheets or in classrooms given more information or less information than we need. And yet in real life, we're always given more information or less information than we need. I think that we will all agree that we do not have time to do everything. So something has to be our focus. And we were speaking just before lunch, we were speaking about how over summer, they lose so much of their learning, right? Over summer, it's like a little reset button hits, and then they come back, and you had those same kids last year, and now you have them again. Last year you taught 3rd grade. This year you teach 4th grade. It's like, oh my gosh, tabula rasa, right? Blank slate. They just like etch a sketch, start over. But they don't lose everything. They lose, what was the number? 60%. They lose 60%. So we better make sure that the 40% that they retain is the 40% that they need when they're 28, right? So if you're going to spend your time in your classroom, if you're trying to parcel out how much time you spend on each thing, you need to make sure that the vast majority of the time that you spend is on what they need to hold on to when they're 28, so that when they lose 60%, they're losing something that they'll be able to pick up again later when they have the math reasoning skills, the critical thinking skills. So if we're sacrificing critical thinking skills for rote computation, I would ask you, to what end? Yes, training them to think critically is very difficult, and we'll talk about reading in a moment. Teaching them to read critically is very difficult because it all takes place in our head. So we have to be aware of how we're thinking, and then we have to teach them how to think this way. It's so much easier just to do it for them, right? It's so much easier to clean my son's room. So much easier than to make him clean it, and it looks beautiful. Every time I clean his room, it's perfect. It would be so much easier doing that, but that's not what I'm trying to teach him. I'm trying to teach him to respect and trying to teach him to take that pride and trying. So yes, it is more difficult to do that, but here's maybe a different way of thinking about it. You are professional educators. Even those of you who were math majors, you're not a mathematician for your profession. You're not. You're not a science major, a social studies major. You are a teaching professional. Your whole job is to teach. And so we need to make sure that we are teaching them what we want them to learn, and those would be the life skills through the math, through the awareness of all of that content. Yeah? Okay, we talked about reading and how it's taking something invisible and making it visible. If we're trying to teach them how to read something, we have to take them through the process of what we do very often without even being aware, and make sure that they become aware of the process. As an ELA teacher, I would much rather teach writing than reading, because you can see it. There's a product. It's really hard to teach reading, but without teaching reading, they have nothing to write about. It has to start here, right? There are no critical thinking skills unless you start here. What is text? Anything. Anything you can read is text. A person is a text, right? Can you read me? Can you read your parents' mood at the end of the day? Absolutely. Anything you can read is text. Read this image that I am projecting on the screen, please. Read it silently to yourself. Okay, did you get it? Do you understand you understand the content presented here, yes? Okay, I'm going to give you another image and then we'll talk. Now read this. Both of these really exist. And for both of these, I yell to my kids in the back, hand me my phone. Actually, this one, I said, take a picture. Yeah. Do you get what they're trying to tell you? Do you understand what they're trying to tell you?
I like the Fijians.
Wait, there are mistakes here, and yet you understand it.
Oh, yeah, right. They have gotten their point across.
Right. This has errors. But does this one?
No, no,
It's hard to read.
just not spelling errors.
They're really, the proof and tail is really important. Comes up 3 times. There's 3 times, right?
How did you read these documents? I want you to think about it. What did you do? How did you attack these documents? Start from the top and went down. Some of you, not all of you. How many times did you read this one? Only twice? I got it. But the words are simple. You are college educated, you're educators. Why was it hard to decipher? Out of order. Did anyone, when I put this up, did anyone look at it and from the instant it came up say, oh, it's going to be an ad for a lost duck? If you read The Lost Duck first, maybe.
That was lost duck and crooked. I'm like, it's a crooked duck.
Before this, had any of you seen an ad for a lost duck before?
Not in California. I did use my information from Lost Dog and Lost Cat.
Right. So you had schema from which to pull. When I first saw this, I pulled up to my butcher on Fruitvale Avenue, and I pull up and I'm reading it, and my head tilts to the side, and I realize that I've read it several times before, because I did not expect it to be an ad for a lost duck. When I saw something posted on the side, really not the last thing in my mind, but I mean, it was several pages in when I thought, oh my gosh, they're advertising for a lost duck. That's just not something you see every day. I know. I know. And yet, this one understood it right away, even though there are so many errors. It's riddled with errors, but I understood it right away because I have to say I've got a lot of experience with liquor stores. I have a lot of experience with liquor stores. I have seen signs and ads and like this a lot. And so I have a wealth of information. I know exactly what they're advertising here, even though, riddled with errors. But I have context to apply here. If you have a context, I could give you the word DOES. DOES. Unless you have the context, you can't read that word. You can sound it out, but you don't know what that word is without a context. It could either be does or does. Right? No. It cannot be do's. We need to remember how incredibly important context is. We were reminded earlier that math is a language, right? It is so incredibly important for us to keep in mind the importance of presenting the context so that when they are reading something in our class, they have that foundation from which to pull. A study showed, it was a standardized test, and it was assessing students' reading comprehension ability, but what they were expected to do is they were reading a portion about baseball, this excerpt about baseball, and they had to demonstrate what they were reading on like a board, and they had to move players around and move a ball and all of this on this board. The poor readers who knew baseball did better than the good readers who did not know baseball. Duh. Of course, right? Because the baseball knowledge gave the context to attack the content area or the text. So we need to always keep in mind how important the context is, and your context is your content, okay? So giving all of these skills, I've been talking all morning about how important these skills are. These skills are what they need when they're 28. However, when they're 28, they also need context. If they are never in a social studies classroom, if they're never in a science classroom, if they're never in another mathematics classroom, they're not going to have the context to attack text. So the content that you teach is incredibly important for their reading ability in the future. You see that? So even if they don't remember all of the computational skill, it's giving them a schema from which to pull in the future. Word problem. Solve this. Solve this on your lined paper. How many times did you read?
Three times. Three, four, five, maybe. Three.
You don't say.
Very rarely, it's possible, very rarely do you read math problems one time. Very rarely. Because you read initially, we talked about this in February, if you remember, the multiple reads. Do you remember? The first read is at which level? Just decoding word level. So the first time I read, I'm going to see, I'm looking, and I'm not consciously aware that I'm doing this, but I'm identifying that there are two numbers here. I see ribbon, I see boxes, but I don't even know necessarily what to do. Right, what operation I'm going to use. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. Maybe after that first read, maybe I'll be able to determine the operation, but very likely I'll have to read it again to see, okay, I have two numbers, I have the general situation now. I'm going to read it again to determine the operation. That doesn't mean that I'm sitting, you have 15 yards of ribbon. You have 15 yards of ribbon. It doesn't mean that necessarily, but I go back to the text to identify. Now that I've decoded, I'm going to go back to the text to see, okay, I have a 15 and a 20. What am I going to do with those, right? Then very likely, you went back again to make sure that your guess was right. Either after you finished the problem or when you said, okay, I'm going to have to divide, right? And you went back to the text, yes, I'm going to have to divide. And then you do the math. Hopefully then, after you got your answer, you went back to see, does that make sense? For the most part, you read at least 3 times. I'm not going to say that everyone in here did, but for the most part, you, college-educated, professional educators, read this at least 3 times. We need to make that explicit for our students. We need to not tell them to read 3 times. We need to show them reading 3 times. We need to demonstrate this to them and show them what it looks like. Show them that you, as a college-educated adult, read this, a 5th grade math question, 3 times. And so if they're in 5th grade, they definitely need to read it 3 times. And I would argue that that last read, after they have their answer, to go back and read it again, that one, I feel like we should force that on them. Because that's where the number sense, does this make sense? That's where the logic, okay. Does it make sense that they each have 7 yards of fabric? No, that doesn't make sense, right? How about this one? Really just pay attention to how many times you're reading this to make sense of what to do. You don't even need to solve this. I just want you to be metacognating, right? Do you see those 3 reads? Can you feel yourself doing that? And do you feel that they're different? Every time you go back, it's a different approach. You're looking at different information. You read math differently than you read social studies. You read math differently than you read a novel because it's a different language. We have to provide the different context for them to attack it, but we also need to show them how to read this text. And I think that this is something that we don't do very often. One thing that I say in my credential classes, to the point where at the end of the quarter, they all, what do we need to remember? Don't forget to teach. Which sounds stupid until you really think about it. And you think, okay, but what have I taught them to do? So don't forget, you can't just tell them to read their word problems. You have to teach them how to read their word problems. You can't just assign word problems. You have to teach them how to attack the word problems, because attacking word problems is very different than attacking naked math problems, right? So we need to teach them the difference, and we need to show them what we as good readers do. So these are the 3 things that I want you to remember about reading in a math class. The multiple reads. We talked about this in February, but do not forget. Do you want a reminder of what essentially the 3 reads are? Decoding, so that's at word level, right? Decoding is essentially just connecting with the words. The second is fluency, and that's connecting the thoughts there. And then the third read is for meaning. That's when you can take it off the page, and I know how to make it actionable. So now that I really understand it, what am I going to do with it? That's that third read. I also want you to remember that anything you read is text. We talked earlier when we were talking about the Common Core State Standards about how we're all in this together. We saw explicitly the connection between the math practices and the reading standards. We need to make that explicit for our students as well. What you do in your science classroom, what you do in your social studies classroom, what you do in your English classroom, you're going to do in here also, but with a different text. And then we need to remember the importance of context-specific fluency. Can we all agree that I am fluent in English? And we know that I'm fluent because I can articulate and I can interpret. I can produce and I can ingest this language fluently. But you can put me in an advanced math class where they're only speaking English and I'm no longer fluent. You can put me in a geology class where they're speaking only English and I am no longer fluent because I cannot participate in the conversation, and it seems as though they are speaking a different language. My son is in the Navy, and we had an opportunity last week to go on their day cruise. We went out on it was amazing. We went out on his aircraft carrier, and several times throughout the day, I sat there and went, I have no idea what you people are talking about, because he and his shipmates would have this conversation, and I'm like, I do not understand any of that, because I don't have the context, background to understand, right? So we need to make sure that we provide them with it, but we also need to keep this in mind when assigning something. When you look at a word problem and half of the class bombed it, is it because they didn't have the context? Or can they really not do the math? So keep that in mind as well. Yes, ma'am?
I'm reminded very quickly there was a word problem and they said in a deck of cards, blah, 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 blah. Well, The kid said, well, how many cards in a deck of cards? They didn't have the context. They had no idea there was 52.
52.
I had a kid, yeah, I think I remember that one. I
Remember that? We
had a
talked
kid say
about
there was
that.
54 too, because there's two jokers.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't play cards anymore. Not or a deck. They might play them online. Or we had in the Kern High School district a few years back. We had a writing proficiency, essentially, assessment, a writing assessment, where we asked the students to nominate someone for a new stamp. They didn't know what a stamp was. And then I think, oh my gosh, that's ridiculous. So I go home. My kids don't know what a stamp is. They don't. When do they ever use them? They don't. When do I ever use them? I have, in the past 3 months, I have mailed 2 things, and they've both been to my son. It's a very different world in which our kids are growing, a very different world. And it's a very different world, obviously, you know, in this community as opposed to other communities where you have this student who has raised 3 of his siblings, and you have this student who has never been responsible for anything a day in his life, and sitting right next to each other. And we have to keep all of that in mind, unfortunately. But with this shift in instruction, with this focus on maybe starting with the word problem and then going to the naked math, we have to keep all of that in mind, because the context of these situations is increasingly important in a situation where they weren't necessarily before, because we just maybe got to the word problems before. So reading in a math class is essentially just reading, yes? Although reading in a math class is attacking a different language, even though you're identifying different things in the text, you do all of these things in your social studies classroom, in your English classroom, in your science classroom, in your music classroom. Even if I'm listening to a piece of music, I'm doing all of these things. If I'm in a wood shop class, I'm doing all of these things. So we need to make sure that we make that explicit for our students. We talked in February about the importance of scaffolding text and skills. When the skill is new and is very difficult, the text should be light, right? So when we're first teaching them like how to read word problems, we should not be using a really complicated operation. You see that? When you're teaching them something new, do it with something that's easier for them to attack, and then apply the more difficult skill, okay? So some of you were talking about reading levels and about, you know, the not having the context and not having, well, how are we going to teach them to attack it when they're just learning the naked math? They don't know how to even do this operation yet, so how are they supposed to? So we're going to teach them the word problems and how to visualize. Many of you were talking about visualizing it and teaching them how to take it from word form and put it in number form. We're going to teach them how to do that with simpler operations that we already know that they own, and then make it more difficult. And I'm talking, folks, like in 15 minutes. I'm not talking about from 1 month to the next. I'm saying at the beginning of the period, we're going to use something very simple, and then we're going to get them into something more complex, because we don't have time to waste. We can't spend a whole month teaching them word problems using addition. We can't do that. But we could start the beginning of the period with an addition word problem and then say, see what you did there? See how many times, even with addition, see how many times you had to read. See how you attacked it. See all of the different strategies you used. Now let's give you a more difficult one. Employ the same skills with this. Okay? So I want to make sure that you keep in mind that what you're expecting them to attack independently needs to be something that they can attack independently. Okay? The other discussion that I was eavesdropping on is not something that I've really thought about in math that much. I think about it all the time in my ELA classroom or in a social studies classroom or a science classroom where I give them a chunk of text to read. We have students who read better than others, obviously. So I have students who are going to struggle more with this text than the student next to them. So we have to, first of all, make sure that we allot enough time for the majority of them to attack the text. Okay, I'm going to say this again. We need to allot enough time for the vast majority of them to attack the text. But I have 32 kids in my classroom. If I'm waiting for the 32nd student to finish, I've lost 31 of them, right? The best thing to do would be to give that student who's really struggling with this text an opportunity to attack it, go and support them as needed, but then to move on and have them attack something else. Because if it should take them, I'm picking a number at random, if it should take them 3 minutes, and after 5 minutes they're still struggling with it, then they're losing the impact of the 3 minutes. Okay, we need purposeful struggle and not for them to be, I don't know, yeah, just frustrated, needlessly frustrated, right? This is where differentiating a text would be great. Again, scaffolding where needed. So I know that this student has language issues that the rest of the class does not. This student just moved here. So where is my body going to be positioned most of the time? Probably right here. I'm going to give this student more support than the rest. But I do want to make sure that I allot enough time for the majority of them to attack it. I want to make sure that I allot enough time for multiple reads. That's the other thing that we don't do. We assign, again, numbers at random, 10 word problems in 20 minutes. So they only have 2 minutes with each word problem. How many times are they going to be able to read that over and over again? Not probably as many as they need. Okay? Other thoughts that you've had? Something that you wrote down about reading?
I like what Kevin said about students sometimes don't even realize that they read multiple reads. They just do it naturally.
We didn't.
Yeah.
We didn't realize how many times we were reading it. Yeah. It's incredibly important that they are made aware of that and that they own it. It's a good thing. It's not getting it by the end doesn't mean you're stupid. It means you've only read it once, right? I wouldn't get it. I can't do anything with it after one read, especially if it's on my level. If it's on my level, I'm going to have to read it a lot.
I don't know what you talked about, but just word callers, just reading words, not understanding what I read at all. Just reading words.
Just decoding?
I don't even know if that's called decoding. Because it's
I thought it was word calling.
yeah, because they don't even know what the word decoding means. No, what it even says. They'll read something, and I call it word calling too. And they do not know what they just read. No, they didn't decode it. It's not even in code to them.
You tell them to
You
do
know
that
what
one
I'm
if they
saying?
don't.
It's like if I read a medical journal, I could read it beautifully.
Yes, and technically, I completely understand what you're saying with the, we want for it to be decoded, we want it to be interpreted into something else, but technically decoding really just means sounding it out. Producing the sound that those symbols, because the symbols are translated into sound. That's the decoding that they're doing. They're only translating the symbol into sound and nothing else. It's the fluency that they have no idea. They can just sound it out. And it's unfortunate because so many teachers mislabel it. They think that because the students can say the word, they understand the word, or that they know the word, and that's not true at all. Okay, let's talk about engagement. You have noticed, I'm sure, you've talked on your other days together about the burden being on the student. The student has to do so much in this instructional shift. One of my students this past quarter cracked me up. Of course, in my credential classes, I model lessons repeatedly throughout the night, but every class, they will experience a different lesson. And one of my students, I said, okay, well, and we always deconstruct the lesson and do the metacognition and everything. And so at the end, I'd say, okay, well, what do I do? I wanted them to say, facilitate. I wanted them to say, coach. I wanted them to say, provide scaffolding as needed. One of my students said, well, you didn't do anything. Okay, well, that's not entirely true. I think I did a lot. But really, the majority of what you do in this shift is on the front end. It's the planning in advance, and then it's intervention as needed. The majority of the work is being done by the students. Dr. Jill Hamilton Bunch talks about how on Friday, we are pulling our pulley cart full of the grading that we have to do over the weekend, and we look a hot mess. And we are exhausted, and we're dreading the weekend because of all of the work that we have to do. And the kids are skipping off to 7-Eleven. But the person doing the work is doing the learning. The person doing the work is doing the learning. And so we have to make sure that we shift that. And the only way we're going to do that is if the students are engaged. So I want you to think for just a moment about how you know if a student is engaged. How do you know if a student is engaged? Jot some notes on your paper. Don't speak yet. Just jot some notes. How do you know if a student is engaged? I have a basket. This is the very last time I'm going to be able to tell anyone this because I get to pack up my office. But I have this basket in my office full of articles. Some actual magazines, but some printed out articles. So embarrassing. I hope Tony wasn't one of them. I don't think he was. All of the articles have been handed to me by people who thought I should read them. Not a single one has been read. Not a single one. People walk into my office or catch me in class or whatever, and they say, oh, I read this and I thought of you, you should read it. Thank you. And it goes in the basket. Not a single one have I read. Because it wasn't a topic in which I was engaged.
Or did you even know what it was when they handed it to you?
No, I knew what the topic was, but it's like I'm not seeking any knowledge in that area. I'm not. Yesterday, I'm sitting at home flipping channels and I pass up a bunch of channels. Why? Not interested. Not seeking any information, and nobody's killing anyone. I don't want to watch it. Right? Right? Not action-packed. Nope, no thank you. Nope, if it's going to make me cry, choose not to. Okay. I'm going to throw out a working definition of student engagement, and I want you to see how it resonates with you. I would like to argue that a student is engaged when they are seeking the answers to their own questions. A student is engaged when they are seeking the answers to their own questions. Think about that. Think about it. A student is engaged when seeking the answers to their own questions. When they begin to start asking questions, absolutely. They say, wait a second, what's going on here? Absolutely.
My kids do it all the time.
Yeah.
They're doing something for. Think about your own kids, like they want you to get you to do something.
So think about that, folks. So many people, adults, professionals, have said to me, I don't care about X because I only care about X. I will not attend a conference on X because I only care about this. I will only, we as adults do this, right? We are only engaged when we want the answer to a question. You could be sitting here, you could be complying with everything I tell you to do. But you're not engaged unless this is something that's piquing your curiosity, unless you're going, wait a second, but how could that apply to this? Or what does she mean by engagement? Or unless you have questions about this topic, it's surface level only. Is that feeling comfortable? So then my challenge to you is for you to think about your own classroom. Where are you allowing your students to develop that curiosity? Because I am not telling you that you are supposed to scrap everything and build curriculum based on something that they care about. Do not. But within everything you do, there needs to be the opportunity for them to say, wait a second, why? Wait a second, what is this? I had the opportunity of working with a Kern High teacher when I was working with Common Core. He's a wood shop and metal shop teacher. And he came to one of my presentations and then invited me into his classroom. And so I went up there and he realized, and he said, 22 years I've been teaching, and I have stripped all of the beauty of manufacturing out of this class. Because, well, so many reasons. We could label so many culprits here. But what could have happened is he could have put a chair in front of his students and said, how do you make a chair? And for them to think critically and really, okay, what tools am I going to have to use? How am I going to solve this problem? I have to persevere. What math am I going to need? All of this. The best Common Core experience right there. But instead, he would say, step one, pick up this piece of wood, this hammer, this many pieces of, these many nails, this many, and all they did was follow steps. There wasn't any exploration, no questioning, so everything was mindless. So we need to think about our own classrooms and where we're just saying, here's a chair, and where we're taking that experience away from them. Okay? We're going to talk about this first. My Jacob asked me what waste meant because we were buying his pajamas. It was pajama day at school, and he only had warm weather pajamas. He needed some cold weather pajamas, and so we had to go. He has this ridiculously tiny waist, so we had to go try them on, and I said, okay, these look great, but we need to try them on and see if they fit you in the waist. And he says, Mommy, what means waist? And so, English teacher, I take the next 10 minutes to explain waist to him, the different types of waist, the different spelling of waist, where you would find a waist. We looked at the mannequin. We talk about elephants. We go into the dressing room. I give a little tug, see where it's pulling. That is your waist. It could be in different ranges, different areas, and we talk about different shapes of bodies and what way, where the waist would be on this shape of body and all of this. Seriously, 10 minutes. I'm using the word over and over, different context, all of this. An hour later, I'm in the dressing room, and I'm trying on a dress, and he says, "Oh, Mommy, I like that. I especially like the waist." He has learned it. But he has learned it because it was his question from the get-go, right? Your students do this all the time. They're playing Minecraft and they don't know what to do next. They're watching, so they watch those YouTube videos. Oh my gosh, those stinking YouTube videos that they watch for hours and hours and hours and learn more. They are engaged. My middle son has ADHD, so homework time at the end of the day is very difficult. 5 o'clock for him to, and I am a firm believer that he needs to be reading as much as possible. So having him read at the end of the day is incredibly important, but it's very difficult to do that when he is assigned an accelerated reader book that he could care less about, right? So the assignment was not an accelerated reader book. The assignment was to read for 30 minutes every night. And so I let him read anything. So he'll get online and he'll look up cheats for different video games, and he'll sit there and read rigorous text for 30 minutes. And I have to tell him it's time to put it away because he is engaged. Okay? So we need to make sure, again, that we are allowing opportunities for engagement. I have a video for us to watch. Part of the video we watched in February, but this time you're going to see children responding to it. And I want you to pay attention to what they're doing here.
Much better.
Probably doing something really hard. Yeah, he's managed to go up. Oh. Whoa! Should have made it through. Oh, wow. The glasses are quite broke. Awesome! It's a car! A car! Honda! A car! And wheels. The inside wheels.
What other questions come to mind?
How wheels do that? The wheel can't just, so it stops and then goes up.
But this is real. This really happened. So what are your thoughts then?
That person's smart.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think that's as possible. But how do they know if those gonna work or not?
Mm-hmm. How do you think they do?
And how does that taking videos and videos and videos?
Okay.
And then how does that go down when science and time?
What kind of science? Tech? What other kind of, you said earlier that the person had to have been smart. Smart in what?
Music.
Uh-huh. What else? What other connections are you seeing?
A Honda.
Mm-hmm.
A
What kind of science? Explain that, Jacob. No, but just describe. You don't need to have specific words. Explosions.
Engineering.
Engineering. Okay.
How many different types of science, I guess, did they describe? They didn't use technical terms, but like if I were a science teacher, what could I now shore up their knowledge with? Oh, what you just described is this. Physics, force, laws of motion. I think somebody said velocity. Did somebody say velocity? I'm sorry? Vectors, friction. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Nuclear science, reactions, transfer of motion, transfer of energy, right? Sound waves. They're 8 and 10. And they had the intuitive understanding of all of these aspects of science, and they are curious, and they are engaged. How do we know they're engaged?
Yeah.
They're talking about it using their own language. They're asking questions. They kept going back to it. They're rereading it over and over and over again. Could I now follow up? I told them, I gave them some information about this, that they had to shoot this, they had to film this over 600 times. Could I now follow up with an article about this commercial? Oh, definitely. Would they read it? Heck yeah, absolutely. No matter what level, no matter what reading level it is, they will read it. And it's partly, I'm sure, because of the home in which they live. But if I leave the book that I'm reading laying around, my boys will pick it up and see what it's about. I know. Because they're like, what's Mom over here laughing about? Or what is she? They're curious. And so they will read it. But they would be able to attack the text also because they have a context from which to pull. This is how we learn the world around us. We have the context first, and then we shore it up with the knowledge after. Sometimes I fear that there is a disconnect between how we learn and how we teach. I'm going to say that again. Sometimes I fear there is a disconnect between how we learn and how we teach. So again, to what end? If we front load, if we take the experience away, if we make them the passive students, the passive participants, I don't even want to use that word in the classroom, we don't learn that way. I learn new things because I am curious about them and I go and seek them out. I was reading in a book yesterday, and the author, she said something about, we all know, or because I bake, we all know, or something like that, that 3 teaspoons equals a tablespoon. I have baked since I was 2. I bake all the time. I've taught math, I've taught conversion, that never sunk in. Never once until I read that yesterday. 3 teaspoons is 1 tablespoon? Oh.
Because you always use a tablespoon.
Well,
Measure out all the teaspoons.
yeah, I go to a conversion chart, right? And I just punch in what I need and it does it for me. But it wasn't important. It wasn't something that I sought out. And I was perfectly fine without that knowledge. Yes? Okay, watch this with me. I'm going to go through this one more time, and I want you to call out questions that you have. I heard several just now, but so one was, are those pennies? What else?
How much money?
How long?
How much money? How many coins in a stack?
5% fan.
Who was working on it?
How much money? How much money?
Why did they only have the braces on one side?
I just watched this yesterday, so that's okay.
Or two sides? Did they glue it? What level? Very good.
It's so interesting because there are always the questions of the stacks and the number of pennies and the weight and all of this. Are they pennies? All of this. But the underlying question is always why? Why did they do that? Why did they make that? Everybody's like, wait a second, why? So now that my students have generated questions, I can follow up with, very much like our math problem earlier, I can follow up with 40 by 40, 13 pennies in a stack. I can follow up with the weight and the diameter and the thickness, and we can do all of the computation because I'm answering your questions. Your curiosity is satisfied. You are engaged in this process instead of starting with this and just saying, I'm giving you all of this, now figure out how many pennies are in the pyramid, right? And there's some information that I'm not going to give you. I'm not going to tell you that I'm telling you the bottom layer is 40 stacks. I'm not telling you what the next one is. I'm just showing you this picture and you have to figure out how many in the next one. This is one of Dan Meyer's math problems. This is the pyramid of pennies. I love this one. I have used this with children through adults with varying mathematical, with the computational standards being different. You can use this in a variety of different ways. He also has given us the Sentinel article that explains the why behind it, gives us the answer to all of the questions, and that's posted on your website as well. I have used this, like I said, with children to adults, and I hand out the article at the end. I have never, ever, ever assigned the reading of the article. I have never said, now read this. Every single time, people instantly start reading because there are questions that they've had that have not been answered by the math. I want to know why. I want to know who did this. I want to know if there's glue. I want to know how long it took. I want to know all of that. Why 13 pennies? Anyone want to guess why 13 pennies? It comes with the height with 13 is the diameter, so it makes it as much of a block, as stable of a block as possible. That's why 13. But that you don't know until you do the computation. The diameter. So it's as squared as possible. I mentioned nothing about the piece of paper. Yes, it's possible that they're just conditioned to do that. Absolutely. But I'm always curious that they read it to the end. No matter which students I'm working with, they never just go, and stop reading, as they do with so many other things that we hand to them, where they'll start and they're like, I don't want to read this. They want to read this because they want to find out, they want the answer to their questions. But if we don't give them the opportunity to create those questions, and a lot of it is time, right? The boys watching that video, I cut that video. They watched it 5 times through and talked the entire time. That takes a lot of commitment on my part as the teacher to allow them that level of exploration. But again, we're going for depth, not breadth of coverage. We want to make sure that we get that deeper experience. Yes? Let's take 10 minutes. Get up, stretch, go outside. It could actually be cooler